Today's episode of What's the Big Idea is brought to you by beliefs. Is your school driven by beliefs? The sort of beliefs that guide learning, practices, and hiring? Does your school have a true north that the entire community can see, that the entire community understands? And is that belief rooted in deep conversations and maybe a bit of conflict along the way? School belief systems. Check it out. Now on to the show. Thanks for checking out What's the Big Idea? I'm your host, Dan Carney. I call this podcast What's the Big Idea because the big ideas come from my guests. And as we live in this uncertain environment of school closures, it's more important than ever to tap into education's big thinkers. Like many of you, I suspect, I wrestle daily with questions of what education could, should, might look like on the other side of the crisis. That's why I'm so excited to have Missy Emler on the show. Missy runs Modern Learners, one of the OGs of online progressive education thought. Originally the brainchild of Will Richardson and Bruce Dixon, Modern Learners has been pushing the envelope through blogging and podcasting for almost a decade. Missy joined them in 2016 and now runs the show at modernlearners.com and through the Lively podcasts. In some ways, interviewing Missy was a challenge. Her range of expertise and understanding about the changes we need in education are so vast, it was tempting to try to touch on too many points in our 40-minute chat. If you're in this moment wondering what steps we can take to ensure that things don't simply revert to the quote-unquote norm, this interview is for you. And if you're like Will Richardson and Bruce Dixon and you enjoy talking ways of moving the discussion about change in schools into real action over a casual lunch, it's also for you. Above all, Missy stressed the need for schools to build and adhere to a belief about what it means to teach and learn. I could not agree more. Missy Emler is the Director of Innovation at Wisconsin Regional Service Agency, serving 31 rural schools, and she also runs Modern Learners. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Missy, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Dan. It's really exciting to be here, and I love the podcast. I've been listening for several months now, and it's one of my go-tos, so thank you so much.
Thank you for that. A lot I want to get to, but Modern Learners is one of my all-time favorites where I've been turning for a long time for progressive ideas, and I want to get to all that. But first, I'd like to have you introduce yourself to my listeners, basically your story, and how is it you came to Modern Learners?
Yeah, so my story is really interesting. I grew up in education. I started out as a high school English teacher, turned high school special education teacher, then principal, and now I'm the Director of Innovation at a regional service agency. And I've always been the techie teacher. I've always been really interested in implementing technology from a usage perspective and really making life easier through the use of technology. And I started following Will in 2004 as an English teacher. Like he was writing, he hadn't written his first book at that point yet, but he was blogging about his experiences teaching journalism and English in the classroom. And I found him to be amazing. And it was about that time that I realized I was sort of a constructivist in regards to my theories of education and how I like to design what was happening in my classroom. I was not very good at fitting inside of the box. I've always been the outlier. And so being the outlier, that's what sort of connected me to Will and Bruce and Modern Learners. We actually met at they were keynote speaking at a Bright Bites Summit, and in my position at the regional service agency, we were using Bright Bites as a region. And so I was at the summit and they were speaking, and Will sat at my table and we just started talking, and we found that we pushed each other's thinking and really enjoyed working together and thinking together. So that was early. That was in 2015. And then I joined the Modern Learners team quite happenstance. It was 2016, and I was actually grieving. Um, I had left my principalship, and I was pretty sad about that. I really wanted to be a principal and lead a school in a more progressive direction. And it was challenging. It was really, really hard. And so I ended up leaving my principal position, not because of the staff or the students, but because the superintendent and the board level made that the work that I thought was important to do made it difficult. And so I had reached out to Will and asked him, what he was doing with the Modern Learners work. They had had a membership site, and I was just asking, thinking about starting a membership site for women in educational leadership. That's why I reached out. And he said, well, actually, it's not going so well. We are struggling to know, what's the product and what's just the service, and then marketing it. And I said, oh, thanks, blah, blah, blah. And I 5 minutes later, after I sent their first email, I'm like, wait a minute, I can help them with that. And so I literally sent an email back to him, and I said, Will, I think I can help you. I've done this, this, and this with marketing, and I think my background in education might be what you need, but I still understand marketing. And so that's how I ended up on the team, and we built Change School.
Yeah, your story of sort of meeting Will and sort of finding that connection really resonates with me. Will Richardson was somebody that I feel like teachers, we kind of go through two educations. We have our teacher training, which is the thing that gets us the piece of paper that lets us walk through the door. But then we go through the second education where we figure out what we believe about education. And when I remember when I first started listening to Will and Bruce, it was really eye-opening. As a young teacher, they were saying the things that not only pushed my thinking, but gave voice to a lot of the things that I was already feeling. I can really remember my mouth kind of hanging open, listening to Will's bluntness, right? Like, oh, right. The testing regime we live under is bullshit. Like, you can say that, that's fine. Like, and so that's been sort of one of the foundations of me as I've grown as an educator. So I can really appreciate that. Can you just briefly outline for my listeners what's the mission of Modern Learners?
So our mission is to change the experience of school for children around the world by putting a focus back on learning. So if we were to have a hashtag, it would be focus on learning, because the narrative in American schools, and actually schools around the globe, is not a lot. It doesn't have a lot to do with learning. And we're really seeing that right now in our emergency response to the global pandemic, right? We're seeing that the function of school is to provide meals and to provide care for children while their parents work. And school has a lot of functions, and those are really important to the prosperity of a country. And I don't want to diminish those, but at the same time, we have gone away from learning. And I believe that we have to really work hard at comparing and contrasting achievement and learning. And when we do that comparison and contrast, then we really can see how much schools don't really focus on learning. And when you're not focused on learning, that's an entirely different experience for the learners.
And how would you define learning?
That is the first question we ask in everything we do at Modern Learners, specifically Change School. The question Will always asks was, how do you believe children learn most powerfully and deeply? And in order to answer the question about what we mean by learning, first we would say that's a definition that you and your school team need to kind of come to and decide on together. And it's based on your context, your local context of your beliefs about learning. And that's what gives your school culture sustainability. But if you were to ask me, I would go back to, just as Will and Bruce always have, and what Modern Learners sort of puts out in the world, Seymour Saracen's version of his definition of learning, which always comes back to a learner's desire to learn more. So when a learner wants to learn more, that is the true definition and experience of learning.
Yeah, that reminds me of Will and Bruce wrote a white paper, The 10 Principles of
Yes.
Modern Learning.
Yep, the 10
No,
principles for schools of modern learning.
there you go, schools. Yeah,
They wrote that in 2017, and every single word is relevant to this day.
I agree. I agree. And just to your point, they wrote that it is the modern learner's newfound capability to take full control of his or her learning that is the educational shift of our times.
We define that and teach about that in relationship to learner agency. And that learner agency is, and the lack of learner agency is really in the spotlight right now. And school has a significant connection to compliance and control. And when you are worried about who's being compliant and who's in control, there really is not learner agency. And so learning is then contrived in some ways.
What about this moment that we're in right now, with schools closed, but some form of learning continuing in some places? This morning, the New York Times published an editorial called "The Coronavirus's Lost Generation of Students," in which basically the editorial board is warning that school children are going to fall behind, in some cases maybe make no gains this year because of this disruption. But the editorial is also based on this entire premise of test scores as the measurement of progress. And their solution is things like longer school days, longer school years. And reading it, I felt like I think all teachers are feeling some version of this concern, but I wonder if we're missing an opportunity to shift education from this crisis.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. First of all, I think that we have a tremendous opportunity globally to shift the narrative of schooling away from assessment, because in most cases, most states and jurisdictions, the testing has been waived because of this act of God or whatever people are calling it. So the accountability measures are actually being removed. And what I'm seeing is so before the pandemic, people would talk about these accountability measures, and people inside of schools would play the blame game. It's the State Department or the feds or whoever wants us to achieve this certain level, and our whole goal in life is to close the achievement gap, etc. Now, the red tape and the bureaucracy in many jurisdictions has been removed, and it is the local control that is putting those conversations back in play. What if they're behind? What if they aren't closing the gaps? What if they don't make gains? And I just would caution us to question what are we measuring it against? And what's the baseline? The standards are still there, but the baselines will definitely change. And standardized tests are designed to have a gap. So the whole plight to close gaps is ridiculous, because the gaps are going to be there. There's no closing the gaps. The tests are designed to create the gaps. And it seems like we talk a lot about Russell Acuff's video that we share in Change School, and he talks about doing the wrong thing right. And I think that when we chase after closing the gaps, we're trying to do the wrong thing right. And doing the wrong thing righter still makes it the wrong thing. And so we talk about that. And the only way to really get to a point where we figure out what is the right work is to really get clear on our beliefs about learning. And that's where, when we get clear about our beliefs about learning, it typically comes back to learner agency. The learners who will be behind are the ones waiting for the adults to tell them exactly what to do. And the adults right now are working over time, like they're on overdrive, because we are trying to be available every second of every day, but we're still expecting students to learn what we think they should learn.
Uh-huh.
And people are worried about engagement. And the reason that kids aren't engaging might not have anything to do with not having access to the internet. It might have a lot more to do with what they're willing to spend time with you on when they're not required to be there. If you inspire them to determine what they want to learn and the roadmap to learning that, they'll naturally engage. But we can't expect every learner to do that. They've never had that opportunity. And so we don't necessarily have a plan to build out learner agency in a remote emergency response to a pandemic. And I would wonder, do we need to? Because if we think that going to school is causation for learning, that tells us a lot about our beliefs. I don't know that school is causation. Certainly, school provides some structure and some opportunities and adults to facilitate learning, which are really, really important. But I don't know that school is causation for learning, because I don't think there's a kid in this world right now who's not learning something from this experience.
School is not causation. I love the way you phrase that. Yeah, it reminds me of a tweet. I've mentioned this already on another podcast, but I just love it so much. Where somebody said that if a student learns in the forest and there's not an adult there to assess it, did the learning actually happen? And I think that goes to a lot of what you're saying. This students, well, they'll be inspired if we're creating experiences and helping foster that agency. We don't, it's not that the grades have to be there to get them to comply, or homework has to be given to get them to comply. It's what kind of system, what kind of opportunities we're giving them.
Right. Well, and Gary Steger would say assessments are never for kids. Assessments are always for adults. Learning happens organically, naturally, socially, all of those things. But I would caution you, like, I'm very pragmatic, right? I work with 31 school districts, and they are saying these kids won't engage. What am I supposed to do if the kids won't engage? If they're not engaged, they're not learning.
Mm-hmm.
I just think it's a matter of asking, what are you asking them to be engaged in? And are you using grades in a way that is still about control and compliance? Because one thing I'm noticing a lot is among school leaders, the emphasis on socio-emotional learning is absolutely real. People want to focus on socio-emotional learning, but we have competing commitments. We say we want to focus on socio-emotional learning, and then when we reach out to kids or we send an email, what we ask them is, where have you been? How come you haven't been here? Did you know you have these three assignments to do? We're reaching out for the purpose of control and compliance, not for the purpose of checking in with them as a human. If we reach out to them with the sole purpose of saying, how are you? What do you think you can do today? What is it you want to learn today? What is it you want to do today? And take our own expectations away and give that opportunity to the learner, you're allowing them some agency, and you might see them engaged, and you might not, because we're in a global pandemic. Let's never forget that.
Yeah, even setting the pandemic aside for a second, what you just said, is that a message for teachers, or is that a message for administrators? Because what about the teachers who are saying, Missy, I love this. I agree wholeheartedly with what you're saying, but have you seen my curriculum? Have you seen what I'm expected to get through? What's your message for those teachers?
I think the message goes back to everyone in your school. The only way to get an answer to that question is to get clear on your beliefs about learning as a school. And everybody has a voice in that, just like everybody has a role to play in the culture of a school. Everybody has a voice in the beliefs about learning. When we get clear on our beliefs about learning as a school, we start to make decisions based on those beliefs. Right now, the belief is that this curriculum that is, as Gary Steger would say, extremely obese, He would say that right now, that's what we seem to believe is important about school. I think if we took the time before to get clear about what we believe, those people who've done that might have more permission to put the curriculum aside. Right
Mm.
now, that permission isn't there.
Yeah, no, I agree. Maybe now would be a good time to shift a bit towards Change School, your program, because
Mhm.
you had a couple episodes ago, you on your Modern Learners podcast, you spoke with Peter Liljedahl.
Yeah,
Was that
Layla Doll. Yeah, he's
Liljedahl?
amazing. Oh
He
God.
was. He was talking about thinking, basically thinking classrooms. And there was one point in the conversation when you were talking about, basically, he was making this point, and you were seconding it about that's all well and good to have people who believe in this and are sort of thought leaders, but how do you convince the others to come along? How do you, back to your point here, that it takes the whole school to build the belief system, but how can you bring people along with these progressive ideas, and that's maybe Change School. We could talk about that a bit, and your work there and what you found about bringing people along.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. Modern learners, so our mission is to change the experience of school for children around the world by putting a focus back on learning. But we look at everything connected to school and learning through the modern learner's lens. And the modern learner's lens has three circles in a Venn diagram. And the one circle is beliefs. We have to know what we believe about learning and how children learn most powerfully and deeply, and not just children, but all people, and because it's universal. And then there's the context. And the context is what's happening in the world that impacts learning in school. And then the last circle in the Venn diagram is practices. So, what are our practices? What do the practices look like? And do they match our beliefs or not? And what we find is the second layer of the lens is what happens when you don't have a strong set of beliefs and understanding of the context and effective practices. You either end up irrelevant, ineffective, or inconsistent. And we want to avoid being irrelevant, ineffective, or inconsistent. And so we have to get to viewing things through the modern learner's lens. So you'll never hear modern learners talk about a specific vendor or a specific curriculum or a specific product, because we will view all of those things through the modern learner's lens. And in terms of bringing everyone along, I actually do not like the term buy-in at all. I don't really like to think about it that way, because I actually think it's about co-constructing the beliefs. And the beliefs are co-constructed through a lot of dialogue and a lot of discourse. And you can't have a school where people like me, who have always felt like the outlier, when our voices aren't heard and there's no consensus drawn, because people like me are just written off as, oh, she's progressive and she doesn't get how it works in the real world, and we have all of these, requirements, right? I believe that if we got to our beliefs about learning as a collective and we stayed true to those beliefs about learning, meeting those guidelines sent down from the state is easy peasy. But we don't take the time to get to our beliefs about learning.
And why
So
is that?
it's
Why
a
why
time.
why do schools not take that time? I agree 100%.
Yeah, I think it's they don't know how to ask the question and wait for an answer, and they don't know how to manage conflict, and we have competing commitments.
Mm.
We want students to have agency, and we're committed to providing for student voice, choice, and agency. But we might be more committed to compliance and control because it's what we know. But you can't be committed to both without conflict. And
Right.
so when you're talking about schools working through the work of getting to the beliefs about learning, it doesn't mean you have to have knockdown, drag out conflict, but it does mean you have to have discourse. And
Yeah.
that takes time. But it saves time in the long run because then when somebody leaves, you have a superintendent or a principal leave. When you're hiring, you know what you're looking for and you can get something consistent. And then when you bring someone in, they're looking at the school's beliefs about learning and they're not trying to push their own on you because you, the school, has made decisions about that already. Sure, they'll grow and adapt, but they need to do that together. That should be the work of the PLC. But we're really too concerned about data in the PLC to get to the beliefs about learning. So we're solving for the wrong thing.
How much are we limited by what we already know, the education that we had growing up, the teacher training we had? And when you talk to teachers around the country, around the world, do you get a sense for that? How much our imaginations are limited by what we went through?
Oh yeah, significantly limited. But I actually think that teacher prep programs, they're focused on the right work. They're teaching you instructional practices. Nothing about being on the progressive side of education should make us think that we don't need instructional practices.
Hmm.
The competing, like people think that those who want to give students agency are promoting a free-for-all. And I'm not in any way promoting a free-for-all. I'm simply suggesting let's get curious about what learners want to learn and let's design learning opportunities so they can learn what they're interested in and what they want to have agency for. But I'm going to bring out my best instructional practices to create the conditions for learning. Yeah. Whether that learning happens or not is less about me and more about the learner. But I have to design for that. It's funny, I hate calling myself a progressive educator. I actually don't think that I am. I think progressive education draws a line in the sand. And it's like you're on this side or you're not. And I'm a both and kind of person. And yet I'm going to ask the provocative questions, but the solutions are only progressive when it's only progressive when nobody will follow you. The goal is to get everybody to do the same work.
I like that.
I'm really counterculture, even for the progressive movement, I think.
No, yeah, of course, because it's progressive. It's all relative, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if it has to be the progressive way or no way, it's not going to be that way.
You wrote recently about sort of like the three phases of the moment that we're in right now, with the coronavirus closing schools. I wonder if you could talk a bit about that, particularly the third phase, which you call transcendence.
Yeah. Well, I think that it's interesting. Since I've written that, I've had a lot more conversations with school leaders and teachers on the daily. And right now, I don't know that anybody's thinking about the transcendence phase, as in what will education and learning become. And yet there are all of the signs that we should be taking this opportunity to step back and examine what is really happening. I think just a few things that could happen. I think I use the word transcendence as the third phase because I think what will happen as a result of this is something that will be very, very different from what we're experiencing now. And I think that there are people around the world who have been thinking about education differently for a long time that will be ready with a plan. But I think I can see school buildings, the architecture and the design of school buildings really changing. I can see an emphasis on place-based learning even more so now, where people will use their communities to learn so that we don't have buildings crammed with students for lots of reasons. But I can see more flexibility in the schedule, things that we've been wanting for a long time. I can see, I can imagine like a not 5 days a week school week. I can imagine a not 8 to 3:30 school day. And what it becomes again will be based on what those local communities decide about what they believe about learning. Because I think what's happening in this specific time is that people are thinking differently, and they're seeing, oh, our students can accomplish the same amount of instruction. They can experience the outcomes can essentially be the same or elevated with less time. And so I think we'll have a de-emphasis of seat time and schedules. So in Change School, we talk about Change School. Change School is our 6 weeks of online coaching. It's a synchronous and asynchronous group coaching course, essentially. And we're launching Change School 10 right now. And we changed it from 8 weeks to 6 because COVID blew up the first couple of weeks, because we used to spend time. I can remember in like every Change School, it always begins with somebody saying, I wish we could just blow up the school calendar or the school schedule. And every time we'd be like, so what would that take? It takes a global pandemic, but now it's all
That's
up
all.
for grabs. It's all up for grabs. And so really, this moment has accelerated the work that we do in Change School. But what it hasn't accelerated is the mindset shifts that are
Mm.
needed in order to make for real transcendence. And that's not going to be the reaction to COVID-19. The mindset shift is going to be the work that some people do intensely over the next few months to make sure that schools continue to be about learning.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because I was reading a provocative essay the other day about just our consumer culture in general. And basically, the author was warning, get ready for an immense push to return to quote unquote normal. Get ready for corporations and government to say, okay, life's back to normal. Now, please go back to exactly what you were doing, shopping the same way you were shopping, buying the way you were buying. And I started thinking about that in terms of school and how can we resist that exact same impulse in education? Okay, great.
Oh, no,
Schools are
it'll be
back
there.
open. Yes, it will be there. And as you said, because we're not accelerating the mindset shift, what would be some practical tips you would give school leaders or teacher leaders who want to accelerate that mindset shift and not just go back to normal when this is over?
Yeah, I think one thing that I wonder about how I ended up in these places that I am, and wonder how I think this way, I think it's the slow drip method, meaning I consume a little bit every day. And that consumption is about the podcast. I mean, through podcasts and through um, reading articles, not in traditional education sector spaces. And all of those things come together to form my thinking. You know, I'm thinking about what do children want to become now, right? Like what is it they want to become? And what do schools want to become? Do we want to become that outdated, archaic thing that didn't evolve? We don't really, although we were in significant danger of becoming that prior to having a circumstance like a global pandemic. And in terms of getting started, I think it has to start with a level of discomfort. And certainly, educators are not feeling comfortable right now. And we have to find a way to balance the discomfort with feeling safe. And that, I think, is what makes the work at Modern Learners, both in Modern Learners community and the work in Change School, so important, because it's in those environments that we can push thinking and still maintain a level of safety for the educators. It is a safe place to learn, meaning you can be vulnerable and say what you're thinking, and there will be people there to ask questions, and you'll know they're pushing, but you'll also know that that's just your opportunity to get clarity around your thinking. I think a lot of what we experience is because we are not clear about our beliefs about learning.
Mm.
And the more clarity we can find in that, the more safe it becomes to think outside of the box. because you're grounded in those beliefs. I feel like a broken record because we've been talking about beliefs about learning, but I actually believe that your beliefs about learning are the on-ramp to any innovation that you want to try that somebody is selling you, essentially, right? You have to, like, you can buy this curriculum in a box, or you can buy this software and it might work. But if you don't know why you're buying it or what you're hoping for it to do based on your own beliefs about learning, we're still not going to make that progress that we're hoping to see.
Yeah, and adding to that, when you don't have that fixed belief, you are you'll just kind of go whichever way the wind blows, right?
Yeah,
And I think
you're
we've probably seen
susceptible
that.
to marketing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, or the
Right.
latest fad or whatever it is. Yeah,
Yeah, the shiny object syndrome, for sure.
yeah. Well, I think you and I probably both agree that a great way to experience new ideas in education is through podcasts.
Yeah, for sure.
And you have a podcast at Modern Learners.
Mm-hmm.
And could you talk a bit about what has podcasting taught you? What have you learned from some of your recent guests that's really stood out to you as some interesting ideas?
Yeah. So I started a podcast 3 years ago called, or I don't know, 4 years ago now, called On the Vendor Floor. And I started it. It's a dead podcast now. It's dried up. Nobody's been there in a while. But that particular experience started because I had attended ISTE and I felt sucked into the vendor floor. And then I got in there and it was like, oh my God, I didn't know I was an introvert until I went into that space. And it overwhelmed me. And I thought, you know what? There's good people in this space doing good work, and they don't have a platform to tell their story unless they have a cool pen or a really great piece of swag. And so I started that podcast on the vendor floor as a result of ISTE. And my favorite question to ask is, how do your beliefs about learning impact the product you're creating? And it was interesting, the products that could answer that and the products that couldn't. But so that was my first, that I learned so much and I was connected to so many people. And now in the Modern Learners podcast, it's a little bit different focus in that the conversations are really rich about focusing on, and they're all about focusing on learning. The most recent pieces, Peter Liljedahl's podcast on thinking classrooms was the bridge between our theme, our math theme. Every month we have a theme in our Modern Learners community, and math was our February theme. And March, our theme was places and spaces. And Peter's thinking classrooms was the bridge between the math theme and the places and spaces. And he blew my mind because he has so much research around things that I knew to be great instructional practices, but I didn't have any research base for them. For example, standing up to do math and writing on non-permanent erasable spaces. That, to me, he has a body of research that made that valid. Mm-hmm. He validated everything I knew, but had no research to back that. I'm excited to see his work come to America and sort of take the world by storm. His book's coming out in August or September, but it's going to be amazing.
Yeah, it was a great conversation. And I thought his larger point that often in classrooms, and he was going into what he said were the classrooms of good teachers, right?
Yes.
These teachers have been recommended to him by people, and going in there and seeing there's activity, there are things happening, but ultimately there's not a lot of thinking going on. And it's in some ways kind of a depressing thought. A lot of effort and time is being put into things, and there's not a lot of thought but on the student's part.
Right. And when we think about thinking, I just want to emphasize this point quickly, because right now I'm seeing a lot of teachers in the online space sort of giving directions and longing for discussions in these online spaces. But our questions aren't taking us beyond a summary level. And it's because we aren't necessarily tying our questions to the cognitive practices in our brains. So we're not relying on neuroscience to formulate those questions. So There's a lot of mileage to be gained around questions that ask for describe something, to compare and contrast. Can you find the part to whole? Can you identify the cause and effect? Can you create an analogy to sort of cement your thinking? But we resort to, what do you think about this? When in reality, instead of saying, what do you think about, or did you like this, or all of those discussion questions that we see, if we could say, compare and contrast this and that, you're going to have a lot more visible thinking than just, what do you think about? And I think we have to get better at asking questions. And that will also lead to students having more agency, because they'll have to clarify their own thinking and put their thinking on display, which will give us an opportunity to facilitate and guide deeper learning.
You work with a lot of rural schools.
Yes.
Uh,
That's my jam.
and yeah, talk a bit about that. What unique obstacles they're facing right now, and sort of what's their moment right now? How can rural schools seize the moment to make some important changes?
Yeah, I think that the challenges are the same as urban. Accessibility is always going to be an issue. Making sure kids have access. And remember, the access piece isn't about having devices. It's really, the digital divide isn't about devices. It is about the amount of data and the speed of data that people have. That is where the inequities occur. So we are seeing some of that inequitable access because of, the expense of broadband, and the last mile is an issue for us. That wouldn't necessarily be true in an urban setting. We have people that still have satellite internet, if they can get internet at all. So that's somewhat of an issue. But just in general, I think it's the rural situation. The piece that I bring is just connection to people from around the world. So I'm able to connect them with people outside of the region, and so that they can learn from them. And I think that sometimes when you're in small town America or rural spaces, you just don't recognize that you actually have a lot more access to people and places through the internet than you actually believed. And so I think one of the biggest things is that's very important for all teachers everywhere, and specifically in rural areas, is that teachers have to be learners.
Hmm.
And when we see ourselves as learners first, we're all in the same game together. And I had a principal say this morning, my question to the principals was, what are you doing to position your teachers as learners in this moment? And the principal's response, which I think said a lot, was, I think teachers are too busy and too overwhelmed in this moment. And that makes me wonder if we really recognize learning when we see it, because I haven't met a teacher in the last month and a half that hasn't been learning in an effort to better serve their learners, because this is a whole new ballgame. And it's just a matter of, are we equipped to accelerate the learning and curate the learning? The week that schools were shut down, I don't know if you were on Facebook, but there was a Facebook group, teaching during COVID-19 or something. It had 45,000 members in this Facebook group in a matter of hours. And it kept populating my Facebook feed, and I kept thinking, oh my, look at all of these people. And it was just like everybody barfing junk in this group. And it was like, oh my God. And it would have been, maybe it was good stuff, but you have no idea if you're going to see the good stuff or not, because Facebook determines what it feeds you, and it might feed you the good stuff or the not good stuff. And it depends on what you interact with. So you're going to see what you're used to. And that's not really a lot of learning. Mm-hmm. So I believe that every teacher is learning right now, but we have to recognize what they're learning as learning. And one of the key indicators that they're learning is the level of their discomfort with what they're experiencing.
Curation.
Oh,
what
yeah.
An important part of teaching, and teaching in the student agency model. Why is curation? What is curation? How would you define curation, and why is it so important?
I actually think it's the most underrated skill known to man. And I think kids do it so much. I mean, they have music playlists, which is an example of curation. And they certainly curate their Instagram feed. They go in and delete things if it doesn't have a certain amount of, likes or engagement, right? So they're constantly curating. But what I think is interesting is that I define curation as pulling the most provocative things that I read, organizing it with some level of some thematic organization, providing my own commentary on the curated piece, and then sharing it. Mm-hmm. It's not the piece. It's not the text that I provide. It's the thematic connection to other text and the commentary that I provide that can shape thinking. It can either provoke or turn people off, right? Like they can go all in or they can push back. And if they're going to push back, they're going to curate to push back. So one of the major benefits of anything that Modern Learners puts out into the world, whether you're in Modern Learners Community or Change School or any number of our courses, what we are really good at, and this started because I've learned from Will and Bruce, who are the best, we're really good at curating content. And we're really good at weaving a theme throughout that curated content. And that moves people's thinking forward. And it gives them textual evidence to support their claims and reasoning.
I will say, as someone who's been following Modern Learners for years, I agree. I've been enjoying your curated lists for a long time and your curated content.
And the curated content is an accelerator.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Missy, thank you so much for joining me today. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I think you pushed my thinking and hopefully my listeners as well.
Thank you so much for having me, Dan. It's great to see you. Have a good day.
Thanks so much to Missy for that chat. If you found yourself nodding through most of the conversation, then head over to modernlearners.com, where you can find the blog, the podcast, and Change School, their 6-week intensive for school leaders. Thanks for listening, everyone. Check out What's the Big Idea next time.
Head's always turned when she walks by. A little flavor in her step, a sparkle in her smile. Talk about a man she ain't got